And one of the questions that came to, where do these ideas come? Where do people get these visions of where the city is going, or what's the how is it the planners that do it? Is it the developers who do it? Citizens? Where do the ideas come from?
Well, the amazing thing to me, when I was a consultant, I used to like to say that one of the reasons consultation was so important to me was because I had to go out and find the good ideas.
Right.
They were out there, and then take credit for it, exactly, and then call it my plan. But really, that's what it is. I think a great plan, and I'm sure Robert, if he spoke to the process a little bit, would talk about all of the different players. The mayor has a stake. The community has a stake.
Right.
Industry has a stake. All these different players need to come together, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why this is a very exciting moment to be involved in planning, because 40 years ago, it was much more linear, and I think we got linear outcomes. We got very simplistic outcomes. We're in a moment when planning has become very complex. There's a lot of different players. We're bringing in new ideas, but we're getting better outcomes.
And pushed by the need to change. I note that he used Mayor Emanuel's little tagline. They were trying to build a 21st century on 19th century technology.
Yeah, it's a good one.
And it is a good one because it's not only the new technology that we can now use, the necessity is mothering us along here, eh?
Absolutely.
And I one of the things I noticed over the years is that although it usually comes in reports from organizations like the planning department or a major development company or citizens group, it is always the product of individual people thinking about their circumstance. And that's why I think we've got a terrific opportunity right now to listen to Antonio Gomez-Palacio. He's the principal of DIALOG, and he is an urban thinker from Toronto.
Nice to see you. Thank you, David.
Welcome.
So I'm particularly happy to be introduced by Jane and David because I have a lot of Jen's ideas in my presentation, and I actually start with an image of David. So now you're all curious, aren't you? I want to talk today, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term value engineering, and you've all been talking about transit yesterday, and it's hard to open the newspapers these days and not get an image of transit. But I want to talk a little bit about part of the equation in talking about transit, and that's the whole thing that's going to make the image of city building come to life. And that's the urban design and the urban planning side of the equation. So here's where my image of David comes in, and I'm glad you talked about how this morning you walked the city and you walked all over the place, because here he is. You've probably actually seen him all over the city. You've encountered him in many places, walking around. You've actually probably even seen signs saying that David is in the city and he's walking around. Of course, unfortunately, he is a bit of an endangered species, and sometimes you see him being threatened. This one I particularly like. It's the end of a sidewalk, and nobody quite knows what he's going to do once he gets to the end of that sidewalk. But David, in fact, has a family, and he has friends, and you can encounter them all over the city, but he is an indicator species. Pedestrians, in my mind, are an indicator species that reveal the health of any given environment. If you see him walking around, if you see him, something is probably right. If you don't see David or any other of pedestrians walking around, there's something critically wrong with that area. So, show of hands. Who has absolutely no interest in ever riding transit and would admit to do that in this room? Not a single hand. Okay. So who has absolutely no option to move around except by using transit? Couple hands, so 6, 7 hands. Okay, so who might use transit sometimes, sometimes not, and has the option to do it? Okay, most of the room. Ironically, that's not who we focus on in the transit systems. So I want to focus today on the maybes, on what's going to make somebody a choice transit user. What's going to make somebody choose to use transit and to do so on any given day? And we talked a lot yesterday about why that's important. So everyone knows the Copenhagen story of cycling all of a sudden became this huge thing, and 70 and 80% of people are cycling in Copenhagen where they didn't used to. what I found fascinating is when they did a survey as to why people are choosing to cycle around the city, only 3% said that they were doing it for moral reasons. It's good for the planet, saves trees, all of these other things. 97% of people said they were doing it for selfish reasons, because my life is better, because I can't stand the commute, because I don't want to pay for parking on the other side of things. So if I put 2 and 2 together, what's going to make somebody a choice rider? It's not going to be because they're saving the planet on a daily basis. It's going to be because they get a better experience out of it, because their life is better on that day. So my presentation has 4 whys, 4 hows, and 3 epiphanies, and I'll go through them. But I really want to stress the notion of a transit urbanism. We need to be thinking about cities and spaces that are built by recognizing that there's an inherent connection between how we move and how we plan those cities. And that if we only focus on the side of the equation of how we move and how we build the transit facilities, but we're not focused around the city that becomes inherent in it, we're actually going to fail at that city building promise upon which the transit system is built. And we all know that we're trying to achieve a new paradigm, moving away from cities that are built around cars and end up delivering the need for more cars to a system that is built around people and inherently start to deliver the ability to have more people, more of David walking around our cities. So, hence the first epiphany, which I'll quote Einstein on this one, and it's insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And in many cases, it's incredible to me, and I'm sure half of the people in this room have been in a conversation with transportation engineers, transportation planners, where we're constantly trying to generate a different vision and using the same models, using the same systems, using the same rationale to try and do that. We can't do that anymore. It's insane. So this is what I mean. I love this photograph. This is somebody who's like, I want to be a pedestrian, but I can't. I'm really trying to do that. So my whys. I'm going to try and build the argument that TOD, or transit-oriented development, and a return on investment, an ROI, are best friends. And how are we going to do that, right? And I was listening to the mayor in Portland once, and really trying to understand the benefit-cost relationship between building infrastructure. And the project that he was talking about, they had actually invested $125 million, and they had a third-party person come in and try and estimate the value that they generated from that, and they estimated $3.5 billion in return on the transit investment. Hey, that's a great return on investment. They are best friends. So what is it that we can measure this? What are some of the metrics that we can talk about the cost-benefit relationship? Well, certainly there's the one on the environment. I'll talk about individuals, all of David's friends, and the economy. And the environment is probably the one that we've heard the most about. We heard it about this morning on the panel. And really the hypothesis is that how we choose to move and how we choose to move as a society has an impact on natural systems and extensively to global warming. And one of the key indicators to doing this is obviously greenhouse gas emissions. And we all know that if you walk and cycle, there's no emissions, but increasingly from public transit to single occupancy cars to larger vehicles, the emissions increase. So I'm not going to harp too much on this, but eventually we all know that there's a limit to how, and sorry, David, it's the only threatening image I have. There's a limit to how we sustain our environment and our life through this way of doing things. From a perspective of individuals and now society and economy is when it starts to get really interesting in my mind. The hypothesis is, again, that our choices can actually have an impact on our livelihood and our quality of life. So think about those, and I'm going to speak about them slightly differently. And to put a case in point, we talk a lot about affordable housing and the need for affordable housing and how people are going to be able to live in the city and live in different areas. But we talk actually very little about affordable mobility. And I don't know about you, but when we were house hunting and we were trying to think about where we're going to live, we started to actually look at our household expenditures. And if I look at the Canadian average of where people are spending money, on food, it's 10%, on shelter, about 20%, clothing, 4%, transportation, 13%, and personal taxes, about 20%. I'd like to reduce the taxes one, but I'm not going to go there. The food and shelter you don't want to reduce, but think about what would you do if you had 13.6% more disposable income, if we could really address that in a broader way. The average Canadian spends about $11,000 a year on transportation. Of that, $10,000 is on private transportation. $1,000 includes transit, cabs, airplanes, everything else. So about $10,000. If I take those $10,000 and look at how it varies on different areas of the city, when you have a low density, not transit-oriented environment, it can actually go up to $15,000 and more. And that will actually decrease when you have pedestrian-oriented environments. And it's very clear when you look at the map of the GTA, where the average expenditure is happening. You have closer to the 3 to 10 in the downtown, and it goes up to $15,000 and $25,000 a year people are spending on their private transportation. Now, if I take the average Canadian price for a house, and this will vary city by city, and I actually start to think about those $10,000 placed against the mortgage of my house, what happens? Well, I get my CMHC calculator, and I put at an average 5% on 25 years, and I put that money against the monthly payments. My mortgage, which would have been $378,000, all of a sudden can become a $523,000 home. That's a $145,000 increase, 38% greater value. But as my wife said when I showed her these numbers, the car you don't get the money back, the house you do. So what would happen if we just put it against the interest? If we just put that same amount against the interest, so it's all money that you're losing. So the same, I put it on my mortgage calculator, the house that I can buy is $719,000. That's actually a 90% increase. So you get a sense, for most Canadians, they invest the same amount in their car than they do in their house. And that's kind of a bit of a forgotten thing that none of us are really focusing on. If I look at a map of Toronto, the houses that are around 250, so that first range, include most of the city. The houses that are in that 570, 500,000, that's the darker blue. So not only am I secluded to certain parts of the city, I in fact have an ability to choose where in the city I want to live if I choose not to have that car. Now look at where the transit lines are. That's not much of a coincidence. So if I focus on society, the hypothesis is that our travel choices are actually subsidized by us as a society and can have a tremendous impact on municipal finances and public health. So every one of your trips in a car is subsidized by the municipality on average by about 6.64 cents. $6.64. That's an incredible amount. And you don't think about it when you grab that car that you're actually being subsidized by that extent. How much, and we have a huge debate on how much are we subsidizing for transit, and if you would bear to guess, it's actually half that amount. The cost to a municipality of somebody taking a transit ride is half the amount to the same cost of somebody taking that ride in a car. And it's very easy for us to forget, I'm just repairing potholes, I'm repairing all these kinds of things, and it's very easy to forget that it's much more sustainable for us to be thinking just municipal finances. How am I going to be supporting the movement of people around my city? If I just look at public health, look at where walkable communities are in the GTA and look at the rate of type 2 diabetes. We know that as walkability increases, that obesity drops. A car-oriented neighborhood will have about 50% of the population to be on the B side. A pedestrian-oriented neighborhood is about 10%. We actually know that mix of use also increases the ability for people to be less obese. So there's a direct correlation between the health of people and the environments that we're generating. So think about, again, cost-benefit analysis. Now to the economy. The hypothesis is that access to travel choices will be generating a competitive advantage to the economic development of cities. So I'll beg you just to focus on the boomerang generation. That's the generation of people who are going to school, coming back home, and then going off to work, and then coming back again. And that's that generation that is extremely flexible. They're in a moment in their lives when they're making life decisions as to where they want to be. And that's kind of the golden generation that every city and every economy is trying to focus and attract and bring to their environments. We heard this morning how every one of them is now the same group of constituency of people from 10 years ago. They're actually choosing to drive 23% less. In fact, they're walking more, they're cycling more, and they're using more transit. So you can very clearly see that there's a direct relationship between the future, the economic future of cities and environments, to actually starting to create an environment that's going to be conducive to this boomerang generation. And we can start even looking at it in house prices. There's a 15% premium over an environment that has a good access to transit. We can start mapping those out in cities as well. So now the question is how? How do we actually start to deliver in a broader way? So similarly, I have kind of 4 things that I want to talk about: transit systems, modal integration, density of use, and urban design. So the transit systems, you'll be happy to know this is my only slide on it. And I love this one. This is in Hamilton. This is a kind of extremely sustainable, transit-oriented, low emissions system. But I start from the premise that you need to have a reliable, convenient transit system. And I'm not in the business of delivering that side of the equation, but that is an integral part of it. We need to have the transit system for everything else to work. I want to focus on some of the other elements. First one is about modal integration. And the big shift here is about not thinking about moving cars, it's about moving people. And it's very simple. You start doing the math. A lane of traffic can move about 800, 900 cars per hour. So 6 lanes of traffic can move about 5,000 people per hour. If I just take 2 of those lanes out and put a streetcar on it, the streetcar can move about 8,000 people per hour. All of a sudden, the same road, the same space, can move almost 4 times the amount of people in that environment. This is about moving people, not cars. And the question for us is going to be, how do we choose to dedicate the environments in our city? How do we choose to move things around? And again, think that every person moving there is costing the municipality $6.64. Every person here is costing the municipality half that amount. So it brings back the question of what's happening in our streets? What are we dedicating that right of way for? And how are we actually city building in and around that? What are the different pieces that are flowing into that equation? A big part of sustaining that environment is density of use. And this is not what I'm talking about, density, but I love this photo. Can you imagine being one of the folks in one of those windows, having breakfast and sharing breakfast across the window? This is not density what I'm talking about. This is the best image I've ever seen of Dubai. It's all the tops of the towers, and the entire city is covered by clouds. This is more what I'm talking about. It's the critical density of users and uses that is going to help us deliver the vision for the city that we want. And in fact, when you map out densities of cities from, for the last 2,000 years, we can see that early on we had densities about 180 people per hectare, and that's dropped significantly over the years. In fact, when we started to tear down a lot of the medieval walls for the cities, it started to drop significantly, but the greatest drop has actually been in the last century. If I just map the last century, we've gone down to an average of 12 people per hectare. Remember, we were in the 180s. We can't go much lower than that. You can't get to 0 people per hectare. So I'll give you another example. This is downtown Toronto. This is City Hall. So imagine the amount of things that are happening here. Just a century later, that's what 12 people per hectare looks like. This is a little bit north of the city. It's the same scale, the same size. This is the type of environment that we can talk about. So I start to map out the correlationship between density, so the darker color is density, and how people walk. So more people walking, the denser the environment. The reverse is more people driving, using transit. There's again a direct correlation between the critical mass of a population and how people choose to move. In fact, the modal split, this is from stats from TTC, the modal split is directly related to the density and the critical mass of those users. What's very interesting to me is that the cost to the economy is the exact reverse. The greater the density, the lesser the cost to municipal services. So we can really start to talk about the correlation between the type of city that we want and the type of mobility that we're going to encourage there, from an auto-dependent to a complete transit-oriented type of an environment. So this is where the urban design kicks in my second epiphany to present, and that is if you screw up the urban design, you might as well pack up your bags and go home. And literally. And this is easier said than done, because I've been in an incredible amount of meetings where at the beginning of the conversation, urban design, yes, everybody wants these great renderings, these great environments where there's a lot of walkability around the transit and all of these kinds of things, but you go through the process and at the end of the equation, you've been valued engineered out of that equation. But think about it, the same in Portland, 84% of them are choice riders. Why are they choosing to use the system? It's because of the quality of that experience. What's going to get David to go from the sidewalk to go to the transit system? That's the big part of the equation. We're working on the Hurontario Main Street, which also seems to be on the news almost every day. How are you going to go from a vehicle-oriented to a multimodal street and really be able to cater to those choice riders? And I'm convinced that if you focus, amongst other things, on the first 10 and 20 meters of that environment, what takes you from the street edge to the transit, what's happening in those first 3 floors of the building, and you get that right, that's going to make a huge difference. That's going to bring that 84% onto your system. This is a photo of Edmonton in 1901, and I love it. The population of Edmonton at that time was 10,000 people. I'm convinced most of them are in this photograph. Look at that. You have absolutely everything in there. It's pedestrian-oriented, it's mixed use, it's a compact, complete street, small fire engine. Wouldn't we all dream for one of those in that size? Everything is in this picture. The question for us now is, we're working on the Edmonton LRT, is how do you start to actually deliver this once again? How do you start to get that integration so that David can walk around the city? Do we need to focus on the scale of that environment? And hence, my third and last epiphany, which is cities are not the problem, they are the solution. Thank you very much.